perfect choice because that big picture is going to dawn clear this morning. Well, not all this morning. It's going to take a little while. But I'm sure we've all heard about how January is named after the Roman god Janus, which is just another example of a god that today nobody believes in anymore. There's about 2,000 gods out there that nobody believes in, but at one time, Janus was a big deal, and the stories and the mythology are actually part of our vocabulary now. Janus, January. He was known as the two-faced god. Call someone two-faced today, what do you think will happen? You're in for trouble because it's regarded as an insult. It's like telling someone they're talking out of both sides of their mouth or they're duplicitous or whatever. But when it comes to Janus, well, he's literally depicted as having two faces. One looking forward to new beginnings and one looking back at the past, the stuff that we've let go of at the new year. And this presents us with a little bit of a paradox. You can't move forward if you cling to the past, and yet we have to remember the past and we have to learn those lessons and carry that learning forward if we want to be successful going forward. We dare not forget the lessons of the past. And then we add to the confusion by talking about things like, what was the name of that really popular book a few years ago? The Power of Now. Thank you very much, Mr. Tolley. Some people got the idea that the book was telling them to forget about the past and stop looking to the future and just live in the now moment. And I remember back when that book was so popular, you know, there were always people who were going to take things to extremes, right? I remember one person who was so taken with the idea of living in the now moment that they did nothing when they lost a job. Enjoying each day, smelling the roses, so to speak, and then they ended up in foreclosure and bankruptcy, which is a classic example of metaphysical malpractice. That's what can happen when we take things too literally or too superficially or take a good idea to an extreme. Most of the time we need to be taking all three of those things into account, right? Past, present, and future. If we become attached to one at the expense of the other two, well, that's a recipe for trouble. We want to keep moving forward, which means we anticipate change. We're open to learning new things, and then we learn the lesson of history. We apply it in the present moment, which is the only time we get to really do anything as we are moving forward, and that's what keeps things rolling. So January is about new beginnings and getting clear on our intentions for the year, and that was a big part of our Burning Bowl service last night. We were writing down things that we want to accomplish, our intentions, maybe something we want to change, something new that we want to learn, or maybe simply just identifying things that we want to see more of in our lives. So this month, as we start a new year, I want to talk about some really interesting new ideas in a book called The Big Picture. It came out in the spring of 2016. It was written by a Caltech theoretical physicist, Sean Carroll. And I mentioned this book last September, and I said that I planned to do a series in January for the new year. So here it is. Here it is. This book was an instant New York Times bestseller, and if you look at those lists at the end of the year of most influential books, this one appears on several different lists of the best science books of 2016. Dr. Carroll advocates a worldview that he calls poetic naturalism. Poetic naturalism, and here's what that means. From a scientific standpoint, there's only one universe, the natural universe, which operates according to one set of rules that we can discern through observation and experimentation and that kind of thing. And I would suggest that the same thing is true of the things that we call spiritual. One realm, one set of rules. There isn't a set of rules that applies to spiritual stuff and another set of rules over here that applies to physical stuff, because that would give us two different sets of rules, and we call that duality, which is the opposite of unity. And oneness, yeah, take your pick. It's the opposite of oneness, it's the opposite of unity. Physical and spiritual are aspects of the same reality that is governed by one set of laws. Poetic naturalism then takes the additional step of acknowledging that while there is one universe and one set of rules, there are many valid ways of talking about it. When it comes to intangible things like the true, the good, the beautiful, or meaning, or purpose and values, we tend to use poetic language. It's what we naturally gravitate to. We speak symbolically, we speak metaphorically, and we're often not aware of it. We're often not even aware of it. And not being aware of it can cause some problems, because poetic language can point to the truth. It can be a way of describing the indescribable, but we have to be careful that we don't confuse the two. When we're not aware that we're speaking in poetic or metaphorical language, we tend to confuse the two, and that's when we can get into some problems. It's like this old story from Zen Buddhism. A master teacher comes along and points the way to truth. It's like the finger pointing at the moon. A master teacher points the way to the truth, and instead of making the effort to look at where he's pointing, we get stuck and we start worshiping the finger that's pointing to the truth. The master points to the moon and the student worships the finger. Here's the moral of the story. Truth has nothing to do with words. Truth can be likened to the bright moon in the sky. Words in this case can be likened to a finger. The finger can point to the moon's location. However, the finger is not the moon. To look at the moon, it is necessary to gaze beyond the finger, right? So the finger is the poetic language, the metaphorical language that points to the truth, to that one set of rules. It all works together. We don't want to be that guy, the one that's worshiping the finger, and that's what can happen when we don't look beyond metaphor and poetic language to discern what they point to. In fact, when you think about it, the real challenge, the real fun and enjoyment that comes from poetry and literature is trying to look beyond the literal meaning, right? We like to interpret poems. We like to interpret stories. Even movies work that way. So seeing a book that's on a bestseller list by a theoretical physicist who embraces the idea of poetic language, who is embracing metaphor and values and the concepts of meaning and purpose, I think is really groundbreaking, because for far too long, the scientific community had abandoned that playing field. You know what I'm saying? Science basically said, well, meaning, purpose, values, poetic language, metaphor, we don't want to mess with all that stuff. They abandoned the playing field, leaving those very important subjects to, philosophers, for example. Now, I'm a big fan of philosophy, but academic philosophers have this tendency to take some very simple and beautiful concepts and turn them into convoluted, complicated subjects that are basically inaccessible to the rest of us. But even worse, when the scientific community abandons the playing field of meaning and purpose and values, religions tend to take over. And they generally make an incoherent mess of the whole thing, because one religion insists that the highest purpose for a human being, for example, is to avoid eating pork and shellfish and to observe the Sabbath in certain ways. Another religion insists that one must receive sacraments from a priest. And yet another religion insists that none of the above is necessary so long as you believe certain things in certain ways about a guy named Jesus. And I could go on and on and on, and they're all mutually contradictory. Throughout history, there have been lots of people who insist that they have an exclusive, direct pipeline to some kind of supernatural authority that we should believe without question. We should believe them. We should believe what they say because they have this direct line. They used to be called prophets or seers or gurus and things like that. Today, they call themselves channelers, and they've been around forever. They insist that poetic language and metaphor, their poetic language and metaphor, is to be taken literally. Worshipping the pointer instead of looking for the truth. And the thing is this, they can't all be right from the standpoint of literal truth, but they can all most certainly be wrong, again, with respect to literal truth. The big picture invites us to step back from such a narrow and dogmatic way of finding meaning and purpose and values and to look at things from a human perspective, grounded in what we know about this wonderful universe based on observation and experience. And what do we really know about this universe? This place in which we, as Paul said, this place in which we live, move, and have our being. He was speaking metaphorically as well, but it's true, isn't it? We live, move, and have our being in this universe, but do we consider ourselves to be a part of it? And if so, isn't it a good idea to get to know as much about it as we possibly can? When we step back and try to take in the big picture, we find that there is ample room for meaning and values and poetic language and metaphor, but we don't have to blindly follow the claims of prophets and gurus and channelers or their scriptures. We can make sense of the world on our own and then speak about it with language that helps us maybe to describe the indescribable. Dr. Carroll insists that everyone has access to the big picture and that we can still talk about it using that poetic language. Here's a quote from the prologue to the book. He says, "I like to think that our lives do matter, even if the universe would trundle along without us. But we have to respect the question and work hard to understand how our desire to matter fits in with the nature of reality at its deepest levels. We are small. The universe is big. It doesn't come with an instruction manual. We have nevertheless figured out an amazing amount about how things actually work. It's a different kind of challenge to accept the world for what it is, to face reality with a smile, and make our lives into something valuable." Get back to that whole idea of personal responsibility again, which is what we're all about in Unity. We don't know everything. He doesn't claim we know everything. But we figured out an amazing amount and we're learning new things every day. How big is the universe? Well, before these guys, Copernicus and Galileo back in the 1500s, before them, we thought that the universe literally revolved around us. Right? The sun and everything else revolved around the earth. We thought that we were literally the center of the universe. After that, when we realized that, oh no, the sun doesn't revolve around us, we revolve around the sun, we had that very humbling revelation that certain groups fought tooth and nail. Catholic Church, it took them until just a few years ago to finally formally acknowledge that, well, Galileo was right, I guess, you know. After that, it took until 1924. 1924 before Edwin Hubble, this guy here, proved that there were other galaxies in the universe. Now imagine that. 1924 was not all that long ago, and even then we still thought that ours was the only galaxy. the universe still revolved around us on that worldview, 1924. So, how many galaxies are there in the universe? How many galaxies like this one that we find ourselves in? Well, just last year, British scientists, using images from the Hubble Space Telescope, this next one here. Oh, I guess I dropped that one. Oh, okay. There it is. The Hubble Space Telescope found out that the universe is 20 times larger than we had previously thought. Now, this is just last year that they came up with this estimate. Before that, the estimate was that there were around 100 billion galaxies out there. Now they think it's more like 2 trillion, based on deep field images from the Hubble Space Telescope. See how it's expanding? It gets bigger and bigger. We're learning new things every day. So when Dr. Carroll says that we're small and the universe is big, it means that we are living in one solar system, part of billions of stars, and one galaxy out of 2 trillion other galaxies, and who knows? Next year we may find out it's 3 times that big. Who knows what we're going to learn? But with that in mind, there's a couple of ways we can look at that reality, and that's the reality. There's a couple of ways we can look at it. Both are poetic in their own way. This is one that comes from an interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Now, he's another scientist who's trying to bring meaning and purpose back in alignment with a scientific worldview. Here's how he looks at it. He says, many people feel small because they're small and the universe is big. But I feel big because my atoms came from those stars. There's a level of connectivity. There's a poetic way of looking at it. And by the way, I am very pleased to say that in 2017, in May of 2017, Neil deGrasse Tyson is going to be at the Community Center Theater in Sacramento. Karen and I have our tickets, and I know that there's still a few left, so it should be a very interesting evening with him. And if you have any questions, we can talk about it after the service. But that's Neil deGrasse Tyson's poetic way of looking at this whole question. He doesn't feel small. He feels big because he sees the sense of oneness, the sense of unity with something big. Now, if you really want to play small, and there are times when we do feel small, hey, the universe is more than happy to accommodate us, right? If we want to play small, the universe will accommodate us. And you know what? A little smallness is okay. It keeps us humble so that we can avoid going back to that old way of thinking that everything revolves around us. But if you want to be big, if you want to be a part of something big, just look up at the night sky sometime, and if that's not big enough for you, don't worry about it, because it's much bigger than we can imagine. So this big picture invites us to examine and re-examine the things that we hold to be true. And let me tell you, that doesn't go on enough out into the world. People have this aversion to questioning their foundational beliefs, to examining and re-examining. They would rather have their beliefs go into the world and then just look for the things that support their beliefs and ignore the other stuff, or try to rationalize it away. There's a term for that, by the way. It's called motivated reasoning. A lot of people do that. The other way to go about it is to simply question everything, examine and re-examine, and look at what the world is telling us, because it's talking to us constantly. When we step back and try to take that big picture, we realize there's ample room for meaning and values. And by the way, how often do we examine our God talk? How often do we really look at our God talk and the poetic language that we use to discern what it's really all about? Whatever we believe, chances are there's always more to it, and that it's bigger and more mysterious than we've been led to believe. We need to own it. It's important to take ownership of our worldview and make sure that it rests on a solid foundation. And then we can use a variety of meaningful symbols and poetic language to talk about it. So Sean Carroll gets the last word today. He tells us that the poet Muriel Rukeyser once wrote, "The universe is made of stories, not atoms." That is absolutely correct. There is more to the world than what happens. There are the ways we make sense of it by telling its story. The vocabulary we use is not handed to us from outside. It's ultimately a matter of our choice. So, Happy New Year. Choose wisely. See you next week. Thank you.